Live from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officers podcast studio, where the vessel's its own best instrument of stability and trim. Welcome. This is William George. Hello, this is podcast 16. We're covering trim. It's chapter 9 of Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer. Trim is the difference between the forward and after drafts. It's that simple. It can be in feet and inches, it can be in meters, it can be in decimeters. But simply you subtract the forward draft from the after draft, and the difference is trim. Change in trim is the difference between the trim before and the trim after you load or discharge a weight. If the trim is by the stern before and after, you just simply subtract the two. If the trim is by the bow, and then after you load or discharge a weight, it's by the stern, you take the two trims and you add the two, because the change in trim will be the sum of the two, going from forward to after, aft to forward trim. And that's the change in trim. Now, there's two methods to calculate trim. There's the added weight method, where we do parallel sinkage and change of trim in 2 steps. And then there's the LCG method, which we basically just calculate the L longitudinal center of gravity and look up the longitudinal center of buoyancy, and we calculate the trim based on the fully loaded condition. Both are useful. For small changes in weight, the parallel sinkage and added weight method is very good. And for large changes in weight, say more than 1,000 tons at a time on a big ship, the LCG method is good. Most loading computers basically only use the LCG method, and we'll talk about both of them here. The hydrostatic particulars we use for trim calculations are basically MTC or MT1, which is the moment to change trim 1 centimeter, or the moment to change trim 1 inch, and TPI, moment to tons per inch, immersion, or TPC, metric tons per centimeter immersion. So how do we do this with the 2-step method, parallel sinkage and change in trim? Well, first of all, if we only shift a weight on board, there is no change in draft at the LCF, but there will be a change in trim if we move weight from aft to forward or forward to aft. The distance it's moved is the actual distance it shifted, say from the after peak to the forward peak. The trimming moment will be that distance times the weight itself, and then the change in trim from the initial condition to the final condition will be that weight times the distance divided by MT1 or MTC, depending on the units you're using. Now, if we're loading a weight using the same technique, you would basically add the weight in theory at the LCF, and the draft at the LCF will increase. How much it will increase? It'll increase by the weight divided by TPI or TPC, whichever is appropriate. And then you move the weight to the final position it's going to be loaded at, and that'll give you a change in trim. The change in trim will be from LCF to where you load the weight, times the weight itself, that's the distance, times the weight gives you the moment, dividing by MT1 or MTC will give you the change in trim. So at both ends of the ship, we know that the draft is going to increase or decrease based on the parallel sinkage and the change in trim, so you can add them together. One interesting thing to note is you can prorate the change of trim forward and aft depending on where the LCF is. If the LCF is exactly halfway between the perpendiculars, you will get equal change in trim. If it's offset, it'll be a proportion to the length between the perpendiculars. And we cover that in the book also. If we talk about the discharging a weight, it's the reverse procedure. We basically take the distance from where the weight is to the LCF for the mean draft you're at, and that'll be your distance times the weight. You can calculate the change in trim, and then the drafts will be decreased because you're taking the weight off at the LCF, and that'll be the weight divided by the TPI or TPC. Again, because you need hydrostatics and the initial and conditions of the vessel, it's not too conducive to doing it with a loading computer. But it's very handy for what if we take 1,000 tons and put it in number 2 hatch, how much will the trim change? You could do it that way, or you could actually use a trimming table. And I'll be talking about a trimming table in another podcast, but not today. Okay, so the other method is the LCG method. Now, the LCG method is the one you use in your loading computers. Basically, what you're doing is you're doing all the bookkeeping in the loading computer to find the longitudinal center of gravity based on the weight moments of each compartment, and you're getting the total weight of the vessel. Once you know the total weight of the vessel, you have the hydrostatic properties for the final draft condition you're interested in. And what we're going to do with those is we're simply going to take the LCG from our weight moment calculation minus the LCB will give us the trimming arm or trimming lever. Excuse me, I got a cold. Now, the trimming lever times the displacement is simply the trimming moment. The trimming moment divided by MT1 or MTC, whichever is appropriate, is going to be the true trim. So let's repeat this again. LCB minus LCG is the trim arm. Trim arm times displacement is the trimming moment. Trimming moment divided by MT1 is the true trim at the perpendiculars, not necessarily at the draft marks. So that's a very useful thing to do, but sadly most people don't know this that well because it's not on the screen at the loading computer. Typically on the loading computer what you see is LCB, LCG, maybe trim arm, and then all of a sudden you see MT1 and trim. Nowhere do you see how did you get from trim arm to using MT1 to trim, because it just doesn't show you the trimming moment. Now, you might ask yourself, how come that it's done that way? And if you look back in the appendix of the book, we have a MARAD stability and trim booklet that's used in the license exam in America. And on page, I'll look it up here, 7, it's here, just bear with me. Okay, it's on page 455 of the book. This is the 4th edition of Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer. What you're going to see is sheet 7A, and there again it shows you the LCG from the forward perpendicular, the LCB from the hydrostatic sheet on sheet 3. The next thing it shows you is the difference between the two, which is the trim lever, and it's labeled aft in this case because it is aft. Then all of a sudden it gives you MT1 and then trim. And the problem of this is the same format you see on the loading computers, and they left out the steps. Now if you look on the same page under the GM calculation, it shows you the whole thing. KM, KG, GM, free surface, GM available, GM required. This is what you normally see on your loading computer. And so the trim is so what I've deduced from this is the loading computers have followed this American style stability and trim book, and what they show you on the screen is the same thing that they show you in this sheet 7A. And the biggest mistake I've seen a lot of people make is that they take the they're looking in a license exam question. Right above it is the LCG calculation for the lightship, crew and stores, lube oil, fuel oil, freshwater, dry cargo, reefer cargo, and deck cargo. And you can get the vertical moment for stability, and you can get the longitudinal moment for trim. And that's the weight moment. That's not the trimming moment. So there's two different moments going on here. One is a weight moment calculation, and I've said before, the calculation of these moments, weight moments, are nothing more than a weighted average. On the other hand, this trimming moment is not a weighted average. This is the trimming arm or trimming lever times the displacement. So the trimming arm times the displacement is the trimming moment, and the trimming moment divided by MT1 or MTC is the true trim. And that's about enough for today on this. The other thing we could talk about is the position of the LCF. If the LCF is not at midships, the trim you calculate between the forward and after drafts will not be the same, applied the same. So in other words, if the LCF is 10 meters or 10 feet or 3 meters forward of the LC midships, what's going to happen? There'll be more trim applied aft to forward. And how do you do that? Well, let's say we have 200 feet between the forward and after perpendiculars. And let's say the LCF is 10 feet forward of midships. So typically, if the LCF was at 0, it would be 100 feet to the forward drafts, 100 feet to the after perpendicular, and the change in trim would be equal. Half of it forward, half of it aft. In the case where it's offset even by 10 feet, now you have 110 feet to the after and 90 feet to the forward, so you'd take the change in trim times the proportion of the length from the LCF. So to the aftermark, it would be 110 divided by 200 times the change in trim. And for the forward mark, it'd be 90 divided by 200 applied to the trim for the change in trim forward. And that's also shown in my book, where there's a pretty good illustration of that in this chapter. So this is Chapter 9, the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer. Thanks for tuning in again, and we'll probably do another one about trim, because there's a lot of nuances here. The biggest thing I'd like you to remember is, though, for zero trim, the required LCG is LCB. Look it up in the zero trim hydrostatic table. And that's it for today. Thank you.